I'm just back from the biggest assignment so far in this war.
From Dallas, Texas, the flash, apparently official, President Kennedy died at 1 p.m. Central Standard.
To say that we are mired in stalemate seems the only realistic, if unsatisfactory, conclusion.
Looks like a good flight. Oh, go, baby. Man on the moon.
Boy.
You know, nowadays, with 7-second sound bites on the evening news, it's a wonder to me anyone watches political television coverage. But back there in the 50s and the 60s, television was entranced by the workings of our political system, and a fascinated public watched. It all really started in the 50s, as television crept into the American living room. Most of the broadcasting was fairly primitive in those early days. But by 1951, coast-to-coast transmission gave us the sense that the upcoming political conventions just might be the first major television event. This time I was still in Washington doing the local CBS News. But when the time came to select someone to anchor the 52 conventions, well, most of the radio heavyweights like Ed Murrow and Eric Sevareid, they looked down on television. They just didn't want to do it. And so, as fate would have it, I ended up at the CBS anchor desk. Well, the conventions were everything we'd hoped they'd be. CBS provided gavel-to-gavel coverage, and the nation awakened to the new medium's potential. Television was new to the political parties, of course, and they didn't try to hide much from us. Believe it or not, they even tried to help.
The chair desires to make a suggestion, about these balloons. Chair knows not in whose favor they are. But if our television audience is going to see what goes on, these balloons have got to remain low, and certainly not between the television set and the audience and what's going on.
Those were the days. What America saw that summer was the last of the old-time political conventions. On the floor, simply chaos. But beneath all that excitement, people milling about, negotiating, twisting arms for their candidates.
Secretary will proceed with the roll call. Isn't an agreement an agreement? We were supposed to have a caucus here. We were supposed to have a caucus of 45 minutes.
That's Governor Fine of Pennsylvania arguing there with the temporary chairman.
I don't care. Listen, we're going to have a caucus of 45 minutes. That's the agreement.
This is the session.
These first nationally televised conventions were a real civics lesson for our viewers.
California.
We tried to take them through all of the parliamentary maneuvers, the political skullduggery. The big fight at the Republican convention was over seating competing delegations for Robert Taft and Dwight Eisenhower. The convention committee held its bitter hearings behind closed doors, but our engineer figured out how to tap the rostrum microphone. He ran a wire to a broom closet up on an upper floor, and there one of our reporters listened in and sent me notes on what was going on. Well, unfortunately, while he was at lunch, a curious reporter from another station picked up the broom closet headset. He just put it on at the moment that Republican investigators traced that wire right up to the broom closet. Well, to get him out of trouble, we had to admit the whole thing. We lost our wiretap, but in the meantime, the television audience besieged the committee with complaints about its secrecy, and they finally opened up their doors. An early victory for television and a free press. In 1952, the convention still decided who the candidate was going to be. Primaries simply hadn't become as universal as they are today, and so delegates at the convention weren't always pledged to a particular candidate. They could even change their votes between ballots if they wanted.
New York!
New York cast 4 votes for Senator Taft and 92 votes for General Eisenhower.
And so the balloting has completed on the first ballot, and unless votes are changed now by motion, General Eisenhower fell some 9 votes short of a first ballot nomination. But now there seems to be activity in the Minnesota delegation.
And Mr. Chairman, Minnesota cast its 28 votes for Eisenhower.
And General Eisenhower is nominated by the Republican convention as its candidate for the presidency.
The public actually witnessed democracy in action and got a pretty good television show at the same time. That year, the Democratic convention went through an all-night session. Debris covered the floor, mostly newspapers, wasn't cleaned up at all. And one of those papers caught fire where the blaze started rising, and it looked mighty darn serious.
Don't get panicky. Don't get panicky. I'll have it out in a minute. It's only a newspaper. Take it easy. Don't get panicky. It's only a newspaper. Just take it easy. Stay here.
To tell you the truth, I was getting just a bit panicky myself. We were in the CBS booth way back in the rafters of that hall. We'd never gotten out of that place. It turned out that many of the exit doors actually had been chained shut to keep crashers out. Could have been a major tragedy.
All right, it's all out. It's all out. It's all out. It's all out.
Mr. Chairman, I want to announce that I did not set the place on fire.
The first commercial computer made its bow in that 52 election. UNIVAC took up the whole floor of a building in Philadelphia. With its flashing lights and its swirling discs, it looked, well, kind of like Dr. Frankenstein's laboratory, I guess. We called it the electronic brain and put it to work.
Good evening, everyone. This is Walter Cronkite speaking to you from CBS Television Election Headquarters here in New York City. The big election night, 1952, the year when the United States picked its 35th president. And now for perhaps a prediction on how this voting is going, let's turn to that miracle of the modern age, the electronic brain UNIVAC, and Charles Collingwood.
This is the face of a UNIVAC. A UNIVAC is a fabulous electronic machine which we have borrowed to help us predict this election from the basis of the early returns as they come in. This is not a joke or a trick. It's an experiment. We think it's going to work. We don't know. We hope it'll work. At any rate...
UNIVAC wasn't programmed now to tell the margin of victory, only what the odds were on a candidate winning. Well, it came in around 9 p.m. and said the odds on Eisenhower winning were 100 to 1. The CBS bosses thought that might be just a little extreme, so they fed some different polling results into UNIVAC, and they got nothing back.
We're having a little bit of trouble with UNIVAC. It seems that he's rebelling against the human element. We've fed in some figures which were a little out of the line of the sort of thing that he'd been expecting, and so UNIVAC came up and said he just wouldn't work under these conditions. However,
so CBS fed in some more second guessing, and UNIVAC finally responded with some lower odds on Eisenhower.
Well, UNIVAC is rolling now. UNIVAC is chewing up figures as fast as we can give them to him and turning out results. The last UNIVAC report quoted the odds as 4 to 1 in favor of Eisenhower's election.
Well, of course, UNIVAC was right all along. Could have been 1,000 to 1. Eisenhower won with a huge margin. That 52 election was a great education for the public. that's not quite how the parties saw it. They decided that their conventions should not show debate and floor fights. They should show unity. So they began making a show out of the conventions. And through the years, they've turned them into little more than choreographed pep rallies. The Rio debates, the potential Donnybrooks on the platform, on delegates' credentials, swept under the rug, out of view with the television cameras. And with each convention, it just seems to get worse and worse. Not much there for the public to sink its teeth into. As television gained prominence throughout the 50s, political candidates became more concerned with communicating an image to the public.
I believe the United States has to move again. I believe
Suddenly, countless people could witness firsthand, at least electronically firsthand, a politician's personal qualities. How did he speak? How did he dress? How did he comb his hair? Well, we at CBS even conducted a television coaching school for them in Washington. Pretty obvious little hints, I'm afraid, like sitting on the edge of their chair to avoid slouching and not putting their arms on the table to avoid hunching their shoulders and looking at the camera like another person. Pretty simple stuff. In 1960, the presidential candidates, John Kennedy and Richard Nixon, by that time they knew the importance of the television image.
Yes, our nation needs Nixon. Experience counts.
What is the most important issue confronting the American people in this election campaign? There's no question about the answer that I have found in traveling all over this nation. Above everything else, the American people want leaders who will keep the peace without surrender for America and the world.
Vote for Nixon and Lodge.
Do you want a man for president who's seasoned through and through, but not so doggone seasoned that he won't try something new? A man who's old enough to know
and young enough to do.
Well, it's up to you, it's up to you, it's strictly up to you.
Around that same time, we, the journalists, were looking for new ways to use the tube. Up to then, believe it or not, there just hadn't been much delving into candidates' personalities, their characters. And I had the idea that television might be able to remedy that. That under the right questioning, during an unrehearsed interview, the camera could reveal an awful lot about the candidates. Maybe get their dander up a little bit, expose their true character. I thought the most logical one to go to first would be John Kennedy. He had more of a reputation of being a regular guy around the Senate. Nixon already had a reputation as vice president as being pretty stiff and formal. Well, so I went up to Capitol Hill, and I told John Kennedy what I wanted to do. Well, he looked at me like I was out of my mind. If I remember, I think that's actually what he said. He, in effect, threw me out of his office. But as I left, I said, if I get the vice president to do it, you'll almost have to, won't you, Senator? He glared at me. He said, you wouldn't dare. I think he meant it. I went right down to Nixon headquarters, and lo and behold, the vice president said, a splendid idea. Be glad to do it. Well, with Nixon aboard, a reluctant Kennedy had to go along.
In these perilous and paradoxical times, we are about to elect a president of the United States. To this purpose, we must look to the men, the issues, the people themselves. I
interviewed Nixon first, and I think I was pretty tough with him.
Well, Walter, good to see you again.
Good evening, Mr. Vice President. Good to see you, sir.
Would you like to sit down over here?
Thank you. Well, Mr. Vice President, I know that you must be aware, have been told by your staff, perhaps, that there are some, percentage certainly unknown, who say, I don't know what it is, but I just don't like the man. I can't put my finger on it, I just don't like him. Would you have any idea what might inspire that kind of a feeling on the part of anybody?
I'll swear it looked like he was reading off a teleprompter. Just as smooth as could be, he popped back this answer.
When people take pictures of you or when you appear on television, you may not make the impression that they like. I get letters from women, for example, sometimes, and men who support me, and they say, why do you wear that heavy beard when you're on television? Well, actually, I don't really try, but I can shave within 30 seconds before I go on television and still have a beard unless we put some powder on, as we've done today.
He was just as smooth on every question. The last one I asked him was, what do you think is the single most important personal quality that you'd take to the presidency of the United States? Leadership, he said. Well, the following week we met Kennedy at his home in Georgetown.
Our interview with the senator will be entirely unrehearsed. It will be spontaneous. It will not be edited. The questions have not been submitted to Mr. Kennedy in advance, and I will be asking them of him for the first time.
How do you do, Senator?
Well, I'm glad to see you.
Well, it's good to be with you.
Thank you very much. Why don't you sit down and we can perhaps talk right here.
Thank you.
To my surprise, Kennedy stumbled on his answers, particularly on the last one. And that really was inexcusable because it was the same question that I asked Nixon the week before.
Senator, what single quality do you think will be the most important that you take to the White House?
Well, I think I've had a historical view of the United States and of its relations through the world. I've been in...
After the show, Kennedy insisted that we redo the interview, in spite of the agreement that it be entirely unrehearsed. He claimed that we had him sitting on a soft couch, all humped up, and they didn't look right. Well, we all knew it was probably the way he answered the last question. I was really sore, so I went into the bedroom where Kennedy was in order to ask him to reconsider. He was in a room that looked like a Harvard dormitory, football pictures on the dresser. He was on a twin bed, chatting away with one of his aides. Kennedy said, "Are you ready to go?" I said, "No, I'm not ready to go, Senator. I think this is grossly unfair. Vice President Nixon didn't do it this way." He said, "I know all of that." I said, "Well, you know, we're going to have a disclaimer saying that Nixon did it without rehearsal and that you insisted on doing it twice." Well, he didn't care. He was going to do it over at any cost. As I left the room, I said, "Senator, we'll do it again. But I think this is the lousiest bit of sportsmanship I've ever seen." Before I got to the door, he said, "All right, let it run." You could always get a Kennedy on sportsmanship. I'd had a more serious run-in with Kennedy earlier in that campaign. Kennedy, of course, was Catholic, and a Catholic never had been elected president. The press saw the Wisconsin primary. It had solidly Catholic and solidly Protestant precincts, so it was a great place to test the public sentiment.
Wisconsin citizens may have turned out in record numbers. Senator
As the vote was coming in, I interviewed Kennedy there at our election desk in Milwaukee.
Senator Kennedy, as we all know, unfortunately, the religious issue has been brought out here, and I remember you're telling us newsmen months and months ago that you expected it to be part of the campaign, and as long as it wasn't the dominating issue, you didn't mind.
I don't believe it should be an issue. I think the Constitution took care of the matter very well when it said there shall be no religious test for office. And there shouldn't be a religious test for voters either. That's what I think that some of the members of the press and others accentuate the religious over what I think are great issues facing the United States in 1960. I would hope my religion isn't one of them.
Senator,
he managed to hide it pretty well on air, but apparently Kennedy was furious. He claimed that someone at CBS had promised his brother and campaign manager, Bobby Kennedy, that I wouldn't ask about his religion. Well, certainly I never would have made such a promise.
Thank you very much, Senator Kennedy.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Meeting again our latest figures here.
Well, Jack Kennedy went to see Frank Stanton, the president of CBS, and he told him he didn't like that Cronkite's reporting, and he reminded him that when he, Kennedy, became president, he'd be naming the members of the Federal Communications Commission, the FCC, which controls the licenses of television stations. This was absolutely direct blackmail. But Frank Stanton showed his courage then, as he had many times before, by just ignoring the threat. You know, I found Kennedy pretty darn arrogant during those first two encounters. That same arrogance, by the way, affected his relations with Congress. Members older and more experienced than he was were so annoyed that they blocked some of his legislative program. But this youthful arrogance didn't seem to affect the public's admiration for Kennedy. 1 week after our presidential countdown show, Kennedy and Nixon met in the first ever televised debate. Now, I don't know if it was his poor showing on our program that did it, but I do know that Kennedy quickly got the hang of television. Anyone who was following the campaign of 1960 remembers that debate. Kennedy, he'd been campaigning in California. He arrived all tan and rested. He was a handsome man, of course, but as our CBS director, Don Hewitt, said, he looked like Adonis that night.
All right, one more. Thank you. Okay. Come on, let's go. All right. Senator.
Nixon had recently had knee surgery, and he'd lost a lot of weight. He looked pale, he looked haggard. This was the largest television audience ever assembled up to then. 70 million people.
I think I better shave.
Nixon joked about it, but he knew that his beard was a problem. So he brought along his own makeup person to help him cover up that 5 o'clock shadow. But when our director saw how pale Nixon looked, he offered to have the network's makeup person apply more. Nixon refused.
First question now to Senator Kennedy.
The candidates need no introduction. The Republican candidate, Vice President Richard M. Nixon, and the Democratic candidate, Senator John F. Kennedy. And now for the first opening statement by Senator John F. Kennedy.
Right from the start, Kennedy looked like the winner.
Mr. Smith, Mr. Nixon, in the election of 1860, Abraham Lincoln said the question was whether this nation could exist half slave or half free.
Nixon never quite got it together during that hour. He stumbled around, halfway agreeing with Kennedy most of the time.
Here again, may I indicate that Senator Kennedy and I are not in disagreement as to the aim. The question is the means.
He looked sweaty and uncomfortable. For the television viewers, the clear winner was Kennedy. But oddly, for those listening to the debate on the radio, it was a draw. But with television being in 9 out of 10 American homes by 1960, the impact of the visual debate was unquestioned. It certainly had some effect on the election's outcome.
It certainly appears that the 34th man to occupy the White House will be 43-year-old John Fitzgerald Kennedy.
In the end, Kennedy barely beat Nixon. It was one of the closest races of all time. But you never would have known it by the way America responded to its new president. The mood of the country changed. Into the White House came this beautiful young couple named Kennedy.
This is Walter Cronkite back at our CBS News booth overlooking the platform on the east portico of the U.S. Capitol, where now in a very few moments, John Fitzgerald Kennedy, age 43, from the state of Massachusetts, becomes the President of the United States.
I remember thinking that this was the first president younger than I was.
To hold the job.
Let the word go forth from this time and place to friend and foe alike that the torch has been passed to a new generation of Americans born in this century, tempered by war, disciplined by a hard and bitter peace, proud of our ancient heritage, and unwilling to witness or permit the slow undoing of those human rights to which this nation has always been committed and to which we are committed today at home and around the world.
It was a new departure, a spirited young approach to government.
The President of the United States.
Inaugural parties were more glamorous than any in recent times.
Our thoughts on this day of great ceremony and great excitement and great festivity. Certainly tonight, the whole world is wishing President Kennedy well in his #1 task to keep the peace. This is Walter Cronkite. Good night.
That was just a great time to be in television. We were breaking new ground almost every day. Kennedy knew the power of television, and he knew he was good at it, so he allowed us remarkable access to the inner workings of his government.
Our eyewitness cameras were on the scene. The first time television has ever been permitted in the office of the president during the actual conduct of official business.
He gave the first live press conference.
Ladies and gentlemen, the President of the United States.
The first chief executive to go on the record, on camera. Kennedy's exchanges with the press always were intelligent. They were always witty.
Mr. President, I wonder if you could tell us whether, if you had it to do over again, you would work for the presidency and whether you can recommend the job to others.
Well, the answer is, the first is yes, and the second is no. I don't recommend it to others. At least for a while. President.
But Americans just wanted more than a look into Kennedy's presidency. They seemed to long for a glimpse inside what appeared to be the man's charmed family life. His radiant young wife gave the world a new standard of style and sophistication. Quite simply, the Kennedys mesmerized the nation, and television played its part. There are few events in our lives that we remember precisely where we were when we heard about them. For those old enough, Pearl Harbor is obviously one such incident, and the assassination of President Kennedy obviously is another. I was having lunch, as usual, at my CBS News desk. It was Friday morning. The President and Mrs. Kennedy were on a political tour of Texas, and they were due this day in Dallas. Otherwise, it was just a quiet, kind of normal news day. And then the press service teletype bells over in the corner began ringing. A rare 5 bells, a bulletin. Well, I rushed over to the UP machine, and I'll never forget those words. 3 shots were fired at President Kennedy's motorcade today in downtown Dallas. By the time that bulletin had cleared the wire, I was shouting, "Let's get on the air, let's get on the air." It turned out we couldn't get on television right away. First, the cameras had to be put in place, and then they had to be warmed up. That was a lesson that we learned the hard way. From that day on, there's always been a camera ready in the newsroom. So, instead of going on camera, I went into an audio booth, interrupted the soap opera that was on As the World Turns, and over a CBS News slide, I began reporting the events in Dallas.
And I gave it a great
Long minutes, I finally got on camera.
This is Walter Cronkite in our newsroom in... There has been an attempt, as perhaps you know now, on the life of President Kennedy. He was wounded in an automobile driving from Dallas Airport into downtown Dallas, along with Governor Connolly of Texas. They've been taken to Parkland Hospital there, where their condition is as yet unknown. We have not been told their condition at Dallas in the downtown hotel room.
Those first moments were really tough to report. There just wasn't much information coming in yet. So I, of course, relayed whatever we could get from Dallas, but then I was trying to fill in some background on the president and on the Texas trip up to then.
10 minutes ago, too.
Lying down there, Walter. This is the picture under it.
There's another picture taken just moments, split moment before the assassination attempt is here. Let's see if we can get a real close-up of that picture. It has just arrived. It shows a smiling Mrs. Kennedy and the president in the front seat of the car, in the back seat of the car. Mrs. Connolly and Governor Connolly, you cannot see behind Mrs. Connolly. The assassin took dead aim. He got the president apparently with the first shot in the head, and then Governor Connolly with the next 2 shots.
People always ask me what I was thinking about at that time. Well, you know, it's amazing the kind of effect a story like that has on a reporter. In a way, I guess we're sort of like emergency crews, you know, ambulance drivers or firemen or doctors in the operating room. When we're busy doing the job, there's just no time for emotion, no time to think about how that's affecting you personally. You're just simply too busy doing the job, trying to get the facts out to the public. You know, it really didn't hit me until I had to read the actual words that President Kennedy was dead.
From Dallas, Texas, the flash, apparently official, President Kennedy died at 1 p.m. Central Standard Time. 2 o'clock Eastern Standard Time, some 38 minutes ago. Vice President Lyndon Johnson has left the hospital in Dallas, but we do not know to where he has proceeded. Presumably, he will be taking the oath of office shortly and become the 36th President of the United States.
That moment, I teared up. I choked. I had just a little trouble getting the words out.
President Kennedy at Dallas Airport this morning.
Later that day, Charles Collingwood came in to relieve me so I could get off the air for at least a little while.
This is Walter Cronkite at our CBS newsroom in New York. And now if Charles Collingwood is standing by.
As he slid into the anchor chair, I realized for the first time that I was in shirt sleeves. And that was a thing we just weren't supposed to be doing at CBS. But in this case, nobody had ever bothered to tell me. A secretary apparently had hung my coat behind me, and she said, "Your coat jacket's here," but that just went in one ear and out the other. I went in my office, which was right there on the newsroom floor. I'd been reporting all afternoon that the telephone lines were tied up all over America, but somehow it just hadn't occurred to me that it was going to affect me. I got into my office, and I wanted to call Betsy, my wife. I wanted to hear a friendly, non-professional voice to commiserate with. And I saw that both of my phones, with 6 lines on each, all lighted up. I suddenly realized that we at CBS also had jammed phone lines. Well, suddenly one of those lines cleared, and I grabbed the phone quickly, hoping I'd get an outside line. And unfortunately, there was another call coming in. It was a terribly affected Eastern-type voice. "Hello." And I said, "Hello." And she said, "I'd like to speak to someone in charge of CBS News." And I said, "Well, you're speaking to CBS News, madam." And she said, "Well, I'd like to complain about CBS having on the air at this terrible moment that awful man, Walter Cronkite, crying those phony crocodile tears when everybody knows he hated John Kennedy." This was the first voice I'm hearing after reporting this horrible event, and I never hated John Kennedy in the first place. And I said, "Madam, what is your name?" And she gave me one of those, very upper-class, hyphenated names, you know, Smith Lawley Johnson or something like that, I don't know. And then she gave me an address, and that was on Park Avenue, as if to impress me with her social standing. Well, I said, "Mrs. Smith Lawley Johnson, you're speaking to Walter Cronkite, and you, madam, are a damn idiot." Slammed up the phone. I sat back, really upset. And then I realized, whoa, hyphenated name, that address on Park Avenue, she's got to be a friend of Bill Paley's, our chairman. And for a moment, I just kind of thought that might be my last phone call at CBS.
The expressions of sorrow, of course, have come from all segments of our population.
CBS stayed on the air for 4 days with no commercial breaks. We followed the events in Dallas and Washington, D.C., and the reaction from across the nation and around the world.
We just got the word that Lyndon B. Johnson has been sworn in as the President of the United States. He was sworn in at 1:38 Central Standard Time. That was 2:38.
Some people have suggested that we deliberately selected our stories and images that weekend in order to calm a grieving nation. Well, nothing could be farther from the truth. We reported the story just as it unfolded, no matter where it took us. We covered the return of the late president's body to Washington. And a new president as he picked up the fallen mantle of leadership.
We have suffered a loss that cannot be weighed. For me, it is a deep personal tragedy. I know that the world shares the sorrow that Mrs. Kennedy and her family bear. I will do my best. That is all I can do. I ask for your help and God's.
We reported the arrest of the assassin, Lee Harvey Oswald.
This is the man charged with the murder of President Kennedy as he is led from the police headquarters in Dallas.
And then, while the country was still in shock from one murder, there came another. Shown live on television, the assassination of the assassin.
Lee Harold Oswald has been shot. The shot came from a man wearing a black hat and a coat. Here comes Oswald. He is ashen and unconscious at this time, now being moved in. He's not moving.
It just seemed impossible. The shock of another murder while there was still a president left to bury. The 4 dark days ended with the final goodbyes to a fallen leader.
Tonight, there will be few Americans who will go to bed without carrying with them a sense that somehow they have failed. If in the search of our conscience we find a new dedication to the American concepts that brook no political, sectional, religious, or racial divisions, then maybe it may yet be possible to say that John Fitzgerald Kennedy did not die in vain. That's the way it is. Monday, November 25th, 1963. This is Walter Cronkite. Good night.
I believe that the times require imagination and courage
and perseverance. I'm asking each of you to be pioneers towards that new frontier. My call is to the young in heart, regardless of age, to the stout in spirit, regardless of party, to all who respond to the scriptural call, be strong and of good courage, be not afraid, neither be dismayed. For courage, not complacency, is our need today. Leadership, not salesmanship. And the only valid test of leadership is the ability to lead and lead vigorously.
Kennedy's use of television created a whole new image of the presidency. It might be said that his was the first television presidency, even unto its tragic end. During those 4 dark days in November, a nation gathered around its television sets and grieved together. By the time Kennedy was buried, 96% of Americans had seen on television some part of the assassination coverage. It was inevitable. The grief over the president's death turned to suspicions of conspiracy. The public simply found it hard to believe that this devastation could have been the act of one man alone, a man murdered before he could even be judged. Just a week after Kennedy's death, President Johnson appointed a commission under Supreme Court Justice Earl Warren to investigate the assassination. And for 10 months, that group of distinguished Americans researched the possibility of a conspiracy. And they found none.
To the White House in Washington comes the final verdict on the fateful tragedy which engulfed the nation 10 months ago.
At CBS, we had some doubts about the commission's findings, as everybody else did. In 1966, a Gallup poll found that 6 out of 10 Americans did not believe the Warren report. Well, there seemed to be so many leads that indicated possible connections between Oswald and various groups, particularly the Cubans. So, 2 years after the report was issued, we spent a lot of money, more than $500,000, when $500,000 was $500,000, and we did our own investigation.
This is a CBS News inquiry, the Warren Report.
This is what a rifleman would see from a 6th-floor window if he tracked an automobile down Elm Street in Dealey Plaza, Dallas, Texas. This is a marksman firing 3 shots from a Mannlicher Carcano rifle at a target below him and moving away. These 2 reenactments represent the heart of the Warren Report. In the view of the Warren Commission, they describe fully the circumstances of the assassination of President Kennedy. But is there more to this story than the Warren Report ever discovered?
For 9 months, I was part of a CBS News task force led by executive producer Les Midgley. We went after what we perceived to be the biggest holes in the commission's report. We built a tower and a car track which matched exactly the Dallas Plaza where the assassination took place. And we fired a Mannlicher Carcano rifle, like the one Lee Harvey Oswald used, to see if 3 shots could have been fired in that time from the same gun. And we shot bullets through blocks of gelatin to see how human tissue would have damaged the bullet said to have hit both Kennedy and Texas Governor John Connally.
The bullet is almost intact. Could such a bullet have penetrated successively a human neck, a human torso, a wrist, and a thigh, and emerged in this condition?
And we reenacted the famous Zapruder filming of the motorcade to help establish the exact time of the assassination. And even though we went into it disbelieving the Warren Report, our research ended up establishing that all of the Commission's judgments actually were well taken. And we put this conclusion on the air, of course.
Did Lee Harvey Oswald shoot President Kennedy? CBS News concludes
That he did. Measured against the alternatives, the Warren Commission report is the easiest to believe, and that is all the report claims. But we have found also that there has been a loss of morale, a loss of confidence among the American people toward their own government and the men who serve it. And that is perhaps more wounding than the assassination itself.
Our investigation helped quiet my doubts, but a lot of people still suspected that Oswald was part of a conspiracy. Even President Lyndon Johnson, after he left office, told me that he had never entirely dismissed the idea that what he called an international conspiracy was involved.
I can't honestly say that I've ever been completely relieved of the fact that there might have been international connections.
You mean you still feel that there might have been?
Well, I have not completely discounted.
Even when I pressed him on it, Johnson simply refused to name those he suspected.
What direction does your lingering suspicion lead you? To Cuba? Is that the area that you feel might have been involved?
Oh, I don't think we ought to discuss suspicions because there's not any hard evidence that would lead me to the conclusion that Oswald was directed by a foreign government, or that his sympathies for other governments could have spurred him on this effort.
We know now what we didn't know then, that during the Kennedy administration, the CIA had plotted to assassinate the Cuban leader Fidel Castro. Now, the FBI and the CIA didn't tell the Warren Commission about those clandestine activities. I'm not sure that it would have changed the Commission's report, but I sure would have liked to interview the head of the Cuban intelligence after that failed attempt on Castro's life. But the Commission's ignorance about a possible Cuban act of revenge is just one of the reasons for the proliferation of conspiracy theories about the Kennedy murder. The most striking, and I think the most shameful of all of those theories, done with Hollywood glitz, of course, is Oliver Stone's movie JFK. Stone combined documentary and fictional footage in a very clever way that absolutely obliterates the truth.
President Kennedy died at
He uses the CBS footage of my announcing the president's death to establish the reality that he avoids in most of the film. His preposterous theory is that top echelons of the U.S. government committed the Kennedy assassination in order to put Lyndon Johnson in the White House. That work of fiction is dangerous. It seriously misleads a whole generation of Americans who weren't alive at that time into an extremely faulty understanding of an important part of their history. And furthermore, if such a conspiracy or any other existed, I don't believe for a minute that it could have been covered up for almost 40 years. A secret that big just isn't that easy to keep. The murder of President Kennedy left us with a feeling of promise unfulfilled. How successful his administration would have been remains forever unknown. President Johnson invoked the martyred president's legacy. He passed the most comprehensive civil rights legislation ever, and then he pushed through Congress a breathtakingly ambitious war on poverty. But all the while, the nation continued to dream of Camelot and what might have been.